Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. I was once in my childhood home, my parents' home, and I was looking through a bunch of Sidurim, of prayer books, and I came across a Sidur, one that had been in our house a long time, and I recognized it. I knew it was a Sidur that came from my father's yeshiva when I was a child in the old city in Jerusalem. We had a lot of book. My father had a yeshiva in the apartment next to ours. And when it was disbanded, a lot of the books came with us. And anyway, this was a good Hebrew-English Siddur, and not easy to get a Hebrew-English Siddur when you live in France. As I went through it this one time, I saw an inscription in the Siddur. 3 Hebrew letters, Roshei Tevot, an acronym. Didn't jump to mind what it was. So I remember I went to ask my parents. I remember when I asked them about it, the sign of their face got really uncomfortable and even disgusted. And they said the letters were for the expression, Hashem Yikom Damo. May God avenge his blood. And then there were a few names of boys who'd been killed in terror attacks long ago when the inscription was made. I think in the 70s, I don't remember the names. But I remember there was something about that inscription. The Hebrew letters were written in this beautiful script, whoever put this in. I knew it was a religious person, because if not, how would they have known the particular acronym, the Roshei Tevot, for it? And my father's yeshiva were mainly English speakers, and this is a beautiful Hebrew script. It just spoke to me of a whole part of Judaism that I knew was there, but which I did not know much about, that my parents had not emphasized or taught me. But I knew it was common enough, a hard edge, right? God avenged the blood. And yes, it's in our Siddur, right? We have so many prayers, prayers I knew about, prayers where we asked God to uproot all the informants and crush them and get rid of them. And we have the end of the Seder, where we, even though many of our Haggadot have alternative, where it says, that God should pour out his wrath upon the nations. All of those always said, well, they're printed in the Siddur. They're part of the set table, and you pick if you'd say them or not. Remnant of different times, of ancient times. But for me, this was different. This was written in fresh ink. This was a dedication that someone wanted God to take revenge for Jewish blood spilt by spilling other blood. And I read enough and knew enough about our tradition to know that this was part of in there amidst all the different streams that we have in Judaism. But somehow over the years, that page of that Siddur was so often in my mind. I knew it was there in that Siddur, on that shelf. And it represented this whole world that I rarely encountered. There was an anomaly in my home, and I felt an anomaly in Judaism. Then, later years, in my 20s, I went to explore Judaism over years, and I encountered that dark part more times, going to all kinds of events in Jerusalem and in Israel, and weddings and at cemeteries and prayer minyanim and services. And suddenly, there, settler youth, often armed and praying with real fervor and the same melodies that I grew up with and know. But there was something about their fervor that I never trusted. It was kind of cowboy kind of attitude. And sometimes I meet people who had direct contact with that world, more so even than I did. I mentioned just because some of you will remember him, my friend Rabbi Shaul Yudelman, who did a series here on Zoom, and he's the head of a nonprofit that tries to work for coexistence in the West Bank, peaceful coexistence that has Muslims and Jews come together and try and work out ways, even in that space, to coexist peacefully with integrity and dignity for everyone. And I knew he trained to be a rabbi in a settlement in Bat Ayin. I knew he'd lived for many years in settlements, and he loved the land. And so I asked him, well, do you often encounter extremism? I remember asking him that once. Remember, he paused. He said to me, and I knew he was as progressive a settler as one can find. And he answered, well, in the settlements, there are some who are peace-loving, and he said, completely frankly, and there are some who hate Arabs. And I met many over years who had no problem expressing those sentiments and, using biblical texts and rabbinic texts to justify, we paid for the land 3,500 years ago. Abraham paid for the cave of the Machpelah, the cave where Abraham and Sarah buried in Hebron, and justified violence. And even beyond that, a whole world, hundreds of thousands strong, the vast majority nowhere near as extremist, but giving some kind of ideological support to varying degrees for all of that. And unfortunately, that part of Judaism is very much alive right now. And still the violence is not being embraced by the majority of the community of settlers or religious Zionists. It's too often excused because of the tremendous losses that they too have been through. And what we can say is, how did this come to be? That in 67, amidst the euphoria of coming back to the biblical lands, right? We speak about Israel as the land of the Torah. Well, the land of the Torah was not in Tel Aviv, was not on the coast. It was in the hills, it was in the West Bank. That's where Abraham and Sarah and everything, and King David, where all of that happened. And that within the spiritual fervor and the intoxication of going back into it, and you bring to that all the baggage of 2,000 years of exile, the parts of our, and the violence experience, that an ugly part of our ancient tradition, just as there were ancient blessings revived, an ugly part was revisited and re-enlivened, in parts of the Bible that I think frankly should have no room in our present day were brought back to life, right? Those biblical calls that one should exterminate enemies and take revenge. In parts of the tradition, commandments and streams of thinking that were softened and even excised and taken away from the tradition over thousands of years of commentary, suddenly brought back to life and become songs that are sung at weddings and songs that are sung by soldiers on the way to war. Right? So in our parsha, we have Pinchas the Zealot. And he's given the Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace, for his act of zealotry, for impaling two of the worst offenders when the Moabites started idolatry and an orgy. And in the second, without even commentating on the good or not of that action, right, the second verse of the parsha has the word revenge in it 3 times. The same word as on the inscription, because thank Pinchas for taking God's revenge into his own hands. And most of the rabbis, not all, but most of the rabbis over the years are uncomfortable with it and have all these different ways of playing it down and saying, well, the Yud and Pinchas in the previous parsha is small to indicate to us that Yud representing God's name, this connection to God was lessened, not greatened by what he did, or that the Vav in Shalom is broken in every Torah scroll because it was an imperfect piece. And Rashi, always trying to get to the root of words, says, what's this word, nikama, that we translate as revenge? He says it means the glowing ember of anger. We're glowing with anger. And then, as he does, and I always enjoy bringing medieval French into it, he says the word in French for that kind of emotion is emportement, which means to be carried away to do the unthinkable. And so we've seen in these past few years, and especially in the past few months, been growing more and more frightening. Settlers attacking Palestinian villagers and taking lives, and more frequently and with impunity. And then the army trying to bring that kind of fervor and really spiritual power coming from that place into war songs, into everything they're doing, trying to meld an ancient power into modern warfare. It just feels like a twisting of the religion that I love so much, and of a part that was always there and had become more powerful. And some of the plans coming out for what should be done to the Palestinians in Gaza right now, coming from that dark place, originating among that world and in leaders who embrace that view. And even in our post-October 7th sorrow of everything we've been through by too many of the Israeli public. There's a reason that 2,000 years ago in a world so much more primitive than ours, the rabbis even then were uncomfortable with Pinchas. There's a reason the religions evolve. And last Sunday, we began the 3 weeks of leading up to Between the Straits, Ben HaMetzarim, leading up to Tisha B'Av. We remember all the calamities that happened to the Jewish people, greatest of all, the destruction of the Second Temple that began 2,000 years of Jewish exile. And as the rabbis recorded it, the Second Temple times and the exile, a lot of it was because of the zealotry in Jerusalem and around this time. And what did the zealots do? They took a narrow definition of what Judaism was about and put everything into it. They forgot about extending compassion even to their fellow Jews and using violence for their nationalistic motives. Last year I was talking to the commentator Yossi Klein Halevi, who's been here, and he was saying how worried he was about Israel, thinking about, right, how did the Second Temple come to be destroyed? Well, you had the corrupt priesthood. He said, well, this is the ultra-Orthodox right now in Israel. We had the zealots ascending, willing to sacrifice anything and everything on the altar of their beliefs. How do you stop disaster? Well, I think for our part, we can do as our own heart and our own spirit reject that part of the tradition and rededicate ourselves to the part of Judaism that we do believe in. And as hard as it is with everything going on, even with the rising anti-Semitism, with October 7th, the hate that's present in too much of the other side that has no compunction about embracing exactly what we're trying to hear not embrace, that desire for revenge and the darkest parts of religion and of ancient religion. Right? Remember when I was encountering these parts of Judaism, much of it is in Israel. I do remember as a rabbinical student once being in a conservative synagogue where I was interning, and coming to visit at Kiddush, not even necessarily Kiddush, was a Sufi leader who I knew from an interfaith event, great person with a big heart, and they just come to check out another place of worship, and maybe because I talked to them and invited them to come. But there were a few people who came and saw that she was a Muslim, and very politely but clearly indicated to them they were not welcome in there. And all I remember is this terrible look on her face as she was walking away, this sense of just shame and embarrassment. And so years ago, I picked up that old Siddur in my house, and I noticed that that page and the whole cover were no longer there. And I wondered, was it because someone in the family had finally grown tired of having that in the Siddur and just torn the whole thing off, or maybe it just fallen out? And I ended up taking that Siddur with me to Chicago and keeping it in my library. Sometimes there are parts of our tradition that need to be removed, even if it means that we have one page less in the Siddur. Shabbat Shalom.